Welcome to another tutorial from Prime TV. In this video, I'd like to discuss the styling alternatives for PrimeReact components. First, we will be doing a regular named class to style a certain panel component. Then I will discuss CSS modules and then finish with the styled components. So let's try to see the panel component that we will be styling. It is here. So first I would like to change the header to some color. If you like to style all of the panels in your application, then you would definitely need the designer. That will really help. For example, with the designer, let's check out Lara Light, and here we should have a panel somewhere. Yeah, that's the panel. And we can see the header surfaces. Let's make them blue or something like that, so that all the headers of your panels will be that the color you specified. You can also customize majority of the settings using the visual mode, but you may also do it with the code mode, but that's the designer. In this video, I would like to show you how to do scoped styling so that you only style a certain component, in this case, the panel. So I will leave designer. Let's start with the name class. It is an alternative. In this case, your application doesn't have a scoped CSS implementation like CSS modules or styled components or something else. So first, let's try to create my panel, or let's call it demo style CSS, and call it my panel, p panel header. These classes like p panel header are documented on the website. So let's choose primary color. That's derived. You may see all these CSS variables exported on the website at the color section. Each theme exports numerous CSS variables, and one of them is primary color and primary color text. So this only applies to my panel, any header inside the my panel. So I can just import this one. Which is, oh yeah, I'm using Next.js, so it's telling me that that's not a CSS module, so it's telling me that import this somewhere else. So I have somewhere a demo CSS that's applied globally to your application. So that's the better place to put this, maybe. And let's remove this one. Okay. And the last thing would be using the class name myPanel. And here that panel has received my style. Of course, this is related to that error before that you've seen. It was related to the Next.js. If you're using something, your own stack, or let's say PrimeReact, that it won't be complaining. So this is, let's call it manual CSS scoping, which may not be the best practice because this style will be available throughout your application, so you can access it from different components, different pages. In case you don't want that, in case you'd like to style it per page or per component, let's say, let's remove it, keep it as it is, and let's use CSS modules. So in this case, panel demo module.css. If in Next.js, if your CSS ends with module.css, it automatically becomes a CSS module. So p panel header. Let me grab this one. Okay, and move it to here. Okay, my panel, the same thing, And then I can import styles from panel demo. And then I can give this to the class name. Styles. Right now I'm using CSS modules. Styles dot, what was the name of the style? Panel, my panel. Okay, and it won't be applied. But if you, for example, if you check this, try this, you will see that it gets the panel, but the cascaded, anything inside that container, the element, won't be applied. That's because the CSS modules apply attributes and they scope the p-panel header as well. That's kind of a limitation. One way to solve this is providing on our side at the component that you're using, adding classes like header class name, content class name, but it gets, I mean, we realize that our components get bloated, so we have tried to avoid that. Actually, we've done that at Prime Faces years ago, and it was like all the components were full of this class name, style class, that's JSF using. For example, suppose that there's a component like calendar, it has tons of elements like cells, dates, disabled dates, and you will end up with maybe more 20 or 30 class name properties. That's not what we want here. So the trick is while using the panels, in this case, the class, the CSS modules, is that we can replace it with child selector. That's to make sure that this only applies to the child header. And this workaround is a known workaround with CSS modules. It just says any element that has p-panel header. You can also use starts with and so on. And then it gets applied, right? So it, for example, you can also use this as well to make sure that to target that p-panel header. Otherwise, that, as I mentioned, due to scoping, due to namespacing, that p-panel header won't be applied. As you may see that this is, for example, what happens if you are just removing? Yeah, it has the exact attribute name. Okay, and this child selector makes sure that if I have nested panels, then they won't get that color. And as you may see that this panel below doesn't have that style. That's the CSS modules. If you have Next.js, you have that built in. And let me try to remove this one and try it with style components, and I'll be using style.jsx because that's also built in for Next.js. I don't need to do any setup with Babel and things. Okay, let's remove the CSS modules. And then I will start with import CSS from styled.jsx. CSS was it? Okay. Now, with style.jsx, you can create your style tag with the JSS attribute, and then you can customize the elements in your own component. But PrimeReact components are third-party. If you're using a third-party component, like components of your own or something like third-party like the PrimeReact, in this case, we have to use CSS resolve, and that gives us the class name, and we give that class name to the component. So it creates a style, then we need to apply it on our side. So let's try it. Constant class name is the one that we will be giving to the component, and styles is the actual style content that we had to include via our component. It should be like this, I think. Let's try to change this. And then we need to get this to our component. There's a destructor here, and edit to the page. And again, as I mentioned on the CSS modules, these are scoped, so we need to find a way. Let's try this one, for example, my panel. Sorry, there's no my panel. I got mixed up. It should be p panel. Sorry, my panel is the one from the CSS module. Sorry for that. So in this case, I don't need to use any specific class name. I can just go on with the actual class names that you may find from the documentation, like p panel. But same situation, there's no header class name here, so that this style is not getting applied. So the style JSX thankfully provides the global feature that prevents that p panel header to be namespaced, so that it won't get any attribute. But it doesn't mean that this CSS that I'll be using applies globally, because this is actually safe. It only applies to the ones that I have applied. So the p panel is still namespaced, but if you check out the implementation of style JSX, so they're using CSS attributes. Let's check this one out. You can see that there's this JSX dash something, like a hash code. And that makes sure that that CSS is scoped. But if I use this global, this p panel header also gets namespaced. So that's why it doesn't get applied. So I'm just using the global header trick. And so that my panel is getting applied. So to summarize, you have like three main alternatives. One is that if your application doesn't have any CSS scoping implementation like CSS modules or style JSX, you need to do it manually, which is not the best practice, because as I mentioned, your class has to resides throughout your application. It is available in every page. So that's not really a true scoped CSS. If you have CSS modules, you can just refer to those CSS classes and import them to your component and apply it to the component. But the thing to watch out for is that we need to, since the cascading doesn't work, we use this class attribute trick. The same thing kind of applies to style JSX. There is no external CSS file here. Everything is inside. And your classes needs to use this global selector. It doesn't make that class global, but it only makes sure that your classes goes through inside the component, in this case the p panel. So hopefully you found this video useful. I have documented everything on this video and more in our new theming guide, where it discusses the theming architecture of PrimeReact, lists the available themes, discusses the designer for global theming and creating style guides, and for scope styling, what we have discussed in this video. There are three examples for named class CSS modules and CSS in JS, so that you can check this out as well. Discusses also, exported CSS variables, how to scale components, how to use PrimeFlex to style your components and align them for creating layouts, plus some utilities as well. So that's it for now. I hope to see you in the next tutorial. Thank you very much.